Hi, I'm Jilly G. Welcome to my kitchen. Today I'm going to show you how to make my gluten-free version of Twix candy bars. And if you've never had one before or never seen one, it's a cookie layer, a caramel layer, and then they're dipped in chocolate. And then when we dip them in chocolate, I'll actually be showing you a chocolate coating, and then I'm going to use carob for my other coating. I'm really curious to see how carob works as a chocolate coating. I've been researching a lot on carob, and if you haven't already, check out my carob brownie recipe. Carob is a really good substitute for chocolate. So the first thing we need to do is get the crust ready. I've already got my oven preheated to 350. I've got, I think it's 11 by 15, something like that. It might even be smaller than that. I should have gotten a ruler. And I keep calling it a crust. This is more of like a cookie recipe that we're going to spread out really thin into the pan. So as you can see, I've got this lined with parchment paper. You don't have to, but it really makes for easy removal to take out our bars and cut them. And then this is just 2 cups of my gluten-free flour and a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. That's it for the dry ingredients. And you really don't even have to mix them together, but there you go. So in this bowl, I've got 3/4 cup of butter. And it's really soft, room temperature. And we just want to get it mixed around. You could use a hand mixer, but a whisk is just fine. Once your butter looks like this, we're going to add in a 1/4 cup of honey. So now just get in here and mix together this honey and this butter. I've got 3 eggs. Everything is at room temperature. And a 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla. And don't worry if it looks like scrambled eggs. It will all come together when we add in the flour and the salt. So once it looks like this, I'm going to add in about 1/2 of my flour mixture. And then I'll switch to my spatula for the rest of the dry ingredients. All in there. And then just get in here with your muscle and mix it together. I love copycat recipes like this. I know exactly what's in them. I can make them a little bit healthier, or I should say I can make them a lot healthier. Not just because I'm using a sugar alternative, but most candy bars, they have so many ingredients. Even if they're gluten-free, there are so many different things in there, most of which I can't even pronounce. So this way I know exactly what's going into my candy bar. And I don't make these all the time. In fact, I rarely eat candy unless I make it. So it is nice for a little treat, and these freeze so well. And then you've got a nice little treat in the freezer for whenever you feel like it. Okay, that is looking really good. So now bring over your pan. And then I've got a little offset spatula. It really is helpful spreading out our crust. So just plop it in here. I try to plop it in a couple of different spots. That way you're not disrupting your paper too much, and it's not so hard to spread out one big blob. Okay, so now we just spread this out into an even layer. And hold your paper in place while you get your crust spread out. Now I prefer this size of a pan because it gives me the thickness of the cookie part that I like. Now, if all you have is a 9 by 13 pan, use that. You just might have a thicker cookie part and a thicker layer of caramel. Now, do your best to make sure it's in an even layer for a couple of different reasons. We want this to bake evenly, but also when we cut it into little rectangles, you don't want a little piece of candy bar that has one really thick end and one really thin end of the cookie part. You want it to be uniform, but do your best. Okay, so this looks really good. So in the oven again at 350 for about 20 minutes. My crust ended up going about 25 minutes. And you want it to be golden brown. It will start pulling away from the sides of the parchment here. And the top is a light golden brown. But I like to feel it. You want it to feel dry, and it does crumble a little bit. But that's what you're looking for. So now we just let this sit here. And by the time our caramel is done, this will be cool enough, but it's okay if it's not completely cooled. I don't know if you can hear that my butter is starting to sizzle. I've got 1 cup of butter in here. I do have my candy thermometer, and you can see that it's not quite in the butter yet, but it will be. You don't want it to touch the bottom of the pan. So I always check that I can fit my spatula underneath it. And I've got this on about medium heat. So to our butter, I've got 1 3/4 cup of honey and 1 tablespoon of molasses. I've got a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. I've got 1 cup of half and half. This is half milk and half heavy cream. And then I've got 1 cup of whole milk, all in there. So we want to stir this constantly. We're looking for a temperature of between 244 and 248. That is the firm ball stage. And I've mentioned before in other videos, you always want to have a bigger pot than you think that you need. Candy is not difficult to make, but it is time consuming. And most of it is doing exactly this. You're just standing here in front of the stove. And maybe you don't want to make candy. You could buy some pre-made caramels, melt them down, and pour them over your crust, and then you would skip this step altogether. Once your caramel is at the correct temperature, in my case I'm going with 244, I'm going to take out my thermometer, turn off the heat, and then I've got a hot pad here that I like to place it on so it's not still on the hot burner. And then I've got 4 teaspoons of vanilla. Now we don't want our caramel to set up before we're ready for it to, but it will stay really hot in the pan for quite a long time. And our crust here, the pan is still warm, but as you can see, I can handle it. My caramel has been cooling for about 15 minutes. And when you stir it around, it's getting much thicker. This is what we're looking for to pour onto our crust. So very carefully. You don't want to pour too fast. As you can see, it's running. Help it along. Now, if your crust was really hot, it would take longer for the caramel to set up. But you also don't want your crust to be too cool, because then your caramel might not be able to spread out. And then just keep adding the rest of your caramel and gently nudging it so it's in an even layer. And I have a little bit of caramel running off my sides, but it's okay. So I'm going to let this cool off completely, cover it in plastic wrap, and stick it in the fridge overnight. Here we are tomorrow, and my caramel cookie portion of this recipe has been in the fridge all night long. I took it out, about 10-15 minutes ago. It's still ice cold. And then I've got some cookie sheets here lined with parchment paper. And then we're doing 2 different coatings for our Twix candy bars. One will be a cocoa powder and one will be the carob powder. And I'm doing the exact same thing, just substituting cocoa for carob. So I've got 2 separate bowls. I already have my coconut oil and my honey measured and weighed actually into each of these bowls. And then they both call for 3/4 cup of cocoa powder or carob powder and 1 tablespoon of vanilla each. And then I've got a saucepan back here with water, and I'm going to get this started. We don't want it to be a rapid boil, just a gentle simmer. And before we get started on that, I wanted to show you, I have this book. I've had it for many years. This is a cookbook, but it also has a lot of other information in it. And it's called Nourishing Traditions by Sally Fallon. And this recipe for this chocolate coating is the recipe from this book. This book uses carob powder. I'm making an adjustment with honey today, so I'll put a link for this below. It's not sponsored. It's just a really good book to have in your library. And I'm just going to leave it on the parchment paper on my cutting board while I cut these into, rectangles or squares. Traditionally, this candy bar is, I don't even know the exact measurements, but it's kind of a long, skinny rectangle. I like to cut mine in about, a 2-bite size. So it's kind of a smaller, skinny rectangle. And my plan for this is to dip half of this in the cocoa powder coating and the other half of this in the carob powder coating. Oh, and I thought I was doing a really good job, and that last one's a little wonky. Now, of course, here on the end, these will be the cook's treat. I'm just going to put these on one of my cookie sheets so they're ready to be dipped. And here I said I was going to go in long, skinny strips. And I, just out of a habit of cutting caramel, I'm almost going in squares. So here, we'll go a little bit longer. And they're not very skinny. Well, that one is skinny. But they're your candy bars. You cut them however you want them to be. Homemade candies, you can make them look really nice, but I don't mind if they look homemade because they are homemade. And these ones over here, you can see where my caramel did spill over the side of the pan. That's all right. That one will just be extra delicious. So my water's almost up to a simmer. I'm going to go with the cocoa powder first. So I'm going to put this bowl on my saucepan. And whenever you're making a double boiler like this, if you don't have a pan that is actually a double boiler, then you just make one with a saucepan and a bowl. And what you mainly are looking for is that the bowl will sit in the pan but not touch the water. So you don't want to fill up your water too high that it will touch the bottom of your bowl. And that bowl fits very nicely in that saucepan. This bowl kind of more rests on top, but it will work the same. So I'm going to hurry and finish cutting up the rest of my rectangular square things here while my coconut oil and my honey are melting. Now I don't want to crowd my cookie sheet here with too many of the ones that aren't dipped, just because this is where I'm going to be placing the ones that are dipped. So you want to leave yourself plenty of room. In fact, I'll probably end up getting more cookie sheets. Very carefully. Okay, back in the fridge for these ones. I've got my saucepan on about low. I'm not sure if you can see, but it is starting to heat up my bowl. I brought over my cookie sheet and then this first couple of rows of my caramel cookies. And then I've got 2 forks here. These are really long tined forks. They are perfect for dipping things in chocolate. So now that my coconut oil is mostly melted like this, you can see that my honey's kind of hanging out there on the bottom. I'm going to very carefully pour in my 3/4 of a cup of cocoa powder. You could use a whisk, but I like using the spatula so I can scrape the bowl and I don't have any dry spots of the cocoa powder. And cocoa powder is known for clumping, but with a spatula I can just mash it against the side of the bowl and get those lumps out of there. I also have 1 tablespoon of vanilla. When I was researching different recipes to make this, there were equivalents of 3/4 of a cup to 1 cup of the cocoa powder or carob powder. And I think this is going to be a little bit too thin to coat our candy bars. So I'm going to add, another 1/4 cup of cocoa powder and see what we get. And this is my first time making a chocolate coating with cocoa powder. So I was really excited to try it. And I do have my burner on low. Once it starts simmering, you can turn it down to low and it will maintain that simmer. But this is really too thin to dip our candy bars in. And unsweetened chocolate doesn't have any sugar in it at all. So I'm not worried that I'm going to make this too bitter because I do have the 2 tablespoons of honey in here. I'm going to go another 1/4 cup of the cocoa powder. And usually candy coatings like this, they do firm up and get more solid once they cool off. But it's still too thin to even stick to our candy bars. If you've ever made a lot of chocolates or candy where you dip them in chocolate, then you know that this is too thin. So I don't want to give up on this yet. And don't worry, it is not ruined. We can still save this, and if it doesn't end up being a candy coating, you can still use it for other things. So I think what I'm going to do at this point, I'm going to remove the bowl from the water bath here, put it on a hot pad very carefully. The bowl does get hot. And see if once it starts cooling off a little bit, it will be the right temperature for dipping. And while we're waiting for that, we can get started on melting our carob powder coating. And then I got a different spatula. I don't want to mix our flavors. And now that this coconut oil is almost melted, most of it, we're going to very carefully add in our 3/4 of a cup of carob powder. And we can get our 1 tablespoon of vanilla in here too. And same thing, you could use a whisk, but I like the spatula. Then I can scrape the bowl at the same time. Now it does seem to be a little bit thicker. I'm just making sure I've got all the lumps out. And I think we might have to do the same thing with this batch, is let it cool off and let that coconut oil firm up a little bit. Check on our other coating here. That's still really liquidy. I'm going to turn the heat off of my burner. And here we go with another 1/4 cup of the carob powder. It's already thicker than the cocoa powder one, but I think I want it to be a little bit thicker. And I noticed that this one's actually sticking to the bottom of the bowl. That's really interesting. I've never had a candy coating do that before. So here, we're all learning something together. Or maybe you've done this before with carob powder. And maybe you've made a candy coating before. Let me know. Let me know what you use and how it works. So definitely thicker. Just want to make sure I've got all of the lumps out of here before we attempt dipping anything. And even though this one is much thicker, I think it's still a little bit on the runny side for coating our candy. But there's really only one way to find out. So let's try a little test piece here. Now, like with anything when you're experimenting, you have to be open-minded that it will not act or look like what you're used to. So it actually coated a little bit better than I expected. Let's do another one here. These are kind of our ends and bits of pieces here. I always like to use forks when you're dipping in some kind of coating. It really helps to get the excess dripped off. Oh, that one. And then try to make sure that they're right side up when you place them on the cookie sheet. Giving it a good stir. It almost seemed like the coconut oil was separating from the carob a little bit. And for that matter, let me know if you've ever made a candy coating out of cocoa powder before. These are both experiments for me today. I've always just used chocolate chips. I'm going to do the same thing with the carob powder, is I'm going to remove it to a hot pad as well. As for this cocoa powder, I'm really not quite sure what to do with this. The reason I put this back on the pan of simmering water, although the burner is off, is because I don't want to keep adding cocoa powder to this. So what I'm going to do, I've got some dark chocolate chips and I keep them in the fridge. And I'll use my same measuring cup. So let's start out with a 3/4 of a cup of dark chocolate chips. And I'm not worried that they'll be too bitter because again, I've got honey in here. So I want this to be warm enough to melt my chocolate chips, but also because the chocolate chips are cold, I'm hoping they'll help thicken and cool this off at the same time. I know it sounds contradictory, but here we are experimenting. That's definitely helping, but I don't think enough. I'm going in with another 1/2 of a 3/4 of a cup. I'm going to let this sit for a minute, continue melting those chocolate chips in there. But let's check on our carob powder. And for that matter, I should mention, the recipe that I'm following from that book I showed you is actually to make carob chips. And you just melt your carob and the coconut oil, whatever sugar you're using, in my case honey and vanilla, and then you spread it on a cookie sheet and then cool it off, put it in the fridge, and then once it's firm you can break it into pieces. So I assumed that it would kind of work the same for a candy coating. But this is what you get when you experiment. Again, these are not failures. They might not be exactly what we're going for, but there is absolutely no need to throw this away. We'll just make it work. I have not used carob chips that are the equivalent of chocolate chips. They're just carob chips. Those might melt down really nicely and make a really nice candy coating. But I don't have any of those. All right, here is our chocolate coating. It has thickened up a little bit more with those added chocolate chips. I want this to cool off a little bit and see if it will get a little bit thicker before dipping any of our candy bars into it. And while I'm waiting for that to cool off, I'm going to stick these ones in the fridge and see what happens. So I've been stirring my cocoa powder coating that I've added the chocolate chips to. It is cooling off and it is getting thicker, but I think I want it to be a little bit thicker. I'm going to add in a little bit more of the dark chocolate chips. And I'm just going to keep stirring it until they're all melted. And if I need to, I can set it back over that simmering water. I think I'm going to start dipping some of these other ends and bits of pieces in here and see how well it sticks to them. And then we can do the same thing. Put these in the fridge and see how it hardens up. Again, I don't think this is a failure of a recipe at all. I think maybe for just a chocolate candy coating, maybe the measurements are off a little bit. So maybe this would make a really good chocolate chip, but not necessarily a candy coating. And I'm already thinking that possibly the same amount of cocoa powder and just half the coconut oil, or even less. Oh, careful. It's actually sticking a little bit better than I expected it to. So that's good. Dipping candies is always messy. And now that they've been kind of sitting for a minute, the chocolate coating, it really is running off. Not as much as I thought that it would, but it still is running off. Into the fridge with the dark chocolate Twix bars, and we'll see how our Carob bars are doing. All right, so it doesn't look like the most appetizing chocolate coating, but it actually is setting up pretty well. I think it just needs to be either a little bit thicker with Carob powder or cooled off enough that it will make a nice coating. And even though it did run off a little bit on this side, really not very much, if you can see that or not. And of course, not as shiny and glossy and smooth as cocoa powder, but that's okay. I think it will be delicious. Now let's move this one aside and bring back our Carob powder coating. I'm not sure if you can see or not, but it does separate from the oil. And so I've been stirring it with my 2 forks here. And I'm debating whether or not to add in a little bit more Carob powder, and maybe it won't separate from the oil like that. I think I'm going to do that. Ooh, don't lose your fork in there. It's the only problem with using a large bowl. And I'm just going to start out with, probably not quite a 1/4 cup again. Get my 2 forks here and I can whisk this together. And that really did make a difference. Well, so far. It thickened it up better, but we'll see if it still separates from the oil. And I actually think it's kind of nice that my cookie sheet was in the fridge. Having that cold cookie sheet underneath these might help firm up this coating a little bit quicker. These are so not the shape or the size of a Twix bar, but you get the idea. And I don't know about you, but they actually look a little bit shinier and nicer right now. So maybe that was the key, adding in just a little bit more Carob powder. Okay, back into the fridge. I'm going to periodically stir this around and kind of investigate if it's still separating or not. Bring back our cocoa powder coating that now has chocolate chips. And these have been in the fridge, and it actually is making a nice coating. It did run off way too much. And I've had this sitting on the stove cooling, not on the hot water. But let's see if it will do a better job as well. Got some more pieces of my candy bar here. And it still is running off. Even though the cookie sheet is cold and these candy bars are cold, it still is running. But that's okay, it's still coating. Not exactly what I was aiming for, but you know what? It's still gonna be delicious, and it still is working. And I just brought back my Carob powder, and you know that last little bit of the Carob powder that I added in? It's not separating from the coconut oil like it did before. And one of the tricky things with dipping a candy bar like this is that because it is a cookie on the bottom, be careful not to get any cookie crumbles in your chocolate coating or your Carob coating. Here is all of our Twix bars dipped in chocolate and Carob powder. There's a definite difference. You can absolutely tell. The Carob powder, they look more like milk chocolate. That is the color. But you can see they're really not shiny like the chocolate cocoa powder ones are. Because my dark chocolate ones have kind of these little edges, I can just show you, it's real easy to just trim those off and make them look neat. Don't throw these away. You can save them and remelt them, or just put them in ice cream. They're just like chocolate chips. Even my carob coating, it did run a little bit on some of them. And these are pretty good same size to give you a nice comparison. So let's just trim off the edges. Save that as well. So here we go. They don't look anything like a Twix bar. But let's go ahead and cut open, and then we'll see that on the inside they look like a Twix bar. Here we go. And that really is the perfect ratio of cookie to the caramel. And then our chocolate. Of course, if you had a much better working chocolate coating, you could get a thicker coating than I did. So they look delicious. I'm sure they will be delicious. I haven't tasted them yet at all. I'm going to take one of each, just so we can get a good idea of how different the coating is. This one is the carob. I should have told you that first. It is so good. And usually when you get a candy bar like this, the main thing that you're looking forward to isn't necessarily the chocolate coating. It's what's on the inside. Absolutely delicious. My cookie part is perfect. My caramel is perfect. Even though it's been in the fridge, it really is soft and chewy. Now let's try our dark chocolate coating. And that one is really good too. But the carob one is absolutely delicious. It doesn't work exactly like chocolate, but it does work. And it is delicious. And it doesn't look as desirable as the chocolate ones, although some of my later versions with a little bit more carob powder did turn out a little bit better than my first run. And I think that's the ratio of coconut oil to the carob powder. I also did another experiment. Because I had dipped all of my candy bars, I still had quite a bit of the chocolate coating left over. And I didn't want to waste any of it. So here is the carob powder. And I find it really interesting that some of the coconut oil seems to have come to the surface, which is very similar to the first candy bars that I dipped in the carob powder. And then of course the chocolate. You can really get a nice coating on a candy bar with chocolate. And I just put them on plates so I could easily get them in the fridge. And I don't even think that they're fully set up in the middle yet, but you could just cut this. Maybe I'm not doing a very good job. Maybe a plate wasn't the best idea. But you could scrape this off and make chocolate chips. Not the traditional chocolate chips that you would buy in a package at the store, but chocolate flakes, like you can sometimes find in ice cream. Oh, here, look, and this is actually flaking pretty good. So my plan for these is to actually do just that, is to make carob chips and make chocolate chips. You can add these into ice cream, you could add these into cookies, and this is what I was hoping it would do. I was hoping once it's firm enough, I'd be able to lift it off of the plate completely. Oh, and look at that. The bottom side of that really is shiny and nice. So yeah, you can definitely make some chocolate chips out of this. Perfect. Look at that. I bet you this one will be able to do that too. This one hasn't been in the fridge long enough. But wow, I'm so happy with that. I'm glad I decided to do the experiment on the plate. Now I think the easiest thing to do would be just to chop this up and then store it in the fridge or the freezer. As a chocolate coating, it needs a little bit of work. And even my cocoa powder coating for a candy bar, it worked, but it also needs a little bit of work. So even if you don't make either of these coatings, you can just make a simple coating with a little bit of coconut oil and some chocolate chips. And you can use milk chocolate, semi-sweet or dark, and then you can make your Twix bars at home. But either way, I'm so happy with it, and I'm learning so much about carob powder. And you know, this is what is really helpful. You experiment with a new product, and then you learn from it, and you still get something delicious in the end. It might not be exactly what you're going for, but then you know that you can apply different changes to it next time. So they don't look anything like a Twix bar candy bar, but they are a really delicious gluten-free, chocolate-free version. And if you're curious about the carob powder that I'm using today, I did get that through azurestandard. The link is in the description box below. If you click on my link for Azure and you use my share code, then that does help my channel. I do earn a small commission. That small commission helps me to buy more products, such as carob powder, to bring you more recipes and videos like this. Let me know what you think if you make this recipe. I hope you still make the candy bars and dip them in your favorite chocolate coating or your favorite carob coating. But thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you have any questions or comments, let me know, and I'll see you on the next one.